The Logoi. St Maximus the Confessor is very deliberate in naming the Logoi as divine wills, theia thelema, after the tradition of St Dionysius the Areopagite. Here, as I will tentatively propose, we may understand them not as works or products of willing, erga, but as the energies or activities which pre-exist creatures. As such, they have their actuality as energies by virtue of God's eternal and immutable will. It is only the created effects, such as the creation itself, which manifest according to a particular time as God determines. This association with the divine will may link in significant ways to other Christian dogmas about God's will. Indeed, it is hard not to think of St Athanasius against the Arians, for in Book 3 he makes the sharp distinction between nature and will with regard to their products, so to speak. We should recall that the term nature in this context translates physis or ousia, being synonymous with essence. When St Athanasius makes this particular distinction between nature and will, he specifically wants to combat the notion that the Son, the second person of the Trinity, is a product of the divine will, because, as he will argue, will is proper to nature and not to persons. The Son cannot be willed into existence by a nature separate from himself, or else he would be a creature, possessing a nature separate from the Father. This understanding will be crucial to St Maximus's theology, because he understands there to be a single divine will, which is inseparable from the divine nature, and this unity of will and nature entails that Christ possessed two wills in accordance with his two natures in the hypostatic union. It's not clear what exactly it means for something to be a product of the divine will, except that it suggests contingency as opposed to the necessity of God's nature and natural properties. Indeed, St Athanasius is adamant that to say the Son is begotten by the will of the Father is to make the Son a creature or a work of the Father, a separate subordinate God, and not the capital G God. As I have covered previously, it is absolutely essential that we recognize no sense of subordination between the divine persons of the Trinity, for they all possess the same divine nature, although they are differentiated by their hypostatic properties. This debate about the divine will certainly informs St Maximus's theology, and could be in the background of his discussion of the Logoi, for as he says, St Dionysius the Areopagite teaches us that Scripture calls these Logoi predeterminations and divine wills. The disciples of Pantainos, the teacher of the great Clement who wrote the Stramates, also say that it is the habit of Scripture to call them divine wills. If God created all things by his will, which no one denies, and if it is always pious and correct to say that God knows his own will, and that he willingly made each of the things that he made, it follows that God knows beings as his own wills, for he willingly brought them into being. If we want to uphold the rough framework of the Cappadocians, as per my last video, we could for argument's sake distinguish between the activity or energy of will and its products, its works or erga. I'm not suggesting that what I have to say in this regard is an orthodox doctrine. It's rather an attempt to follow through with what I've noted so far. That said, it seems that we could consider the Logoi to be divine energies or activities of the will, and not works as such. What is clear from St Maximus is that the Logoi are not themselves creatures or created effects. Rather, he is clear that they pre-exist creatures. Nor are the Logoi merely the forms or universal natures of creatures, as in an essentialist theory of creatures, conceived of as having a substantial existence in the divine intellect. Rather, the trickiness of this doctrine lies in the fact that the Logoi are both in and of God, and they are also both the archetypes and final causes of creatures, precisely because they are purely actual determinations of God's eternal will. Indeed, to speak of them as determined is relative to God's essence and God himself, who transcends everything infinitely. Relative to creation itself, however, the Logoi are effectively infinite, in that even in the eschaton, creatures continuously and perpetually actualize the Logoi of their being in synergy with God, and that is what it means for creation to realize God's intentions for it. There is no end to this, and hence this doctrine is sometimes termed perpetual progress, and associated closely with St Gregory of Nyssa. Like the Church Fathers before him, St Maximus upholds the absolute distinction between created and uncreated. And if we are to define the fault line along this relationship, I think perhaps we could give an account of the created as being that which is a work, ergon, brought about by the will of God. At the same time, it is quite possible that there are works, so called, that are not creatures, but natural to God. This is where, even if we must humour this notion of applying a hard and fast distinction between energeia and erga, we must always remember that the terminology is not rigidly fixed. What is most important and central to St Maximus is the reality of the Incarnation, and its absolute significance for all creation. It is a cosmic mystery, which cannot be rationally comprehended by any creature, but it reveals to us, while still remaining in a sense hidden, the destiny and purpose of creation. This purpose is perhaps best expressed with the term synergy, and is manifested supremely by the theandric energy of Jesus Christ, who is fully God and fully man, united without confusion or separation. This mystery permeates every work of St Maximus's theology, and I hope we can make it just as central a reality for ourselves and our understanding of the world. Power and energy. In Ambiguum 10, St Maximus talks about a valid sense in which we can talk of natural theology, or rather of natural contemplation. It is clear that we learn that a cause of being exists, without however attempting to know what this cause is in its own essence, for its reflection is not projected outward into beings on the basis of which we might have been able, if even only minimally, to refer back to it, in the way one infers a cause from its effect. In seeing these integral modes of distinct existence, we acquire the concept of him who holds together and preserves them all in an ineffable union, in such a way that each is clearly distinct and marked off from the other, consistent with the principles according to which they were created. There is a strong sense in which it is God's simple, transcendent nature that holds all things together in unity without collapsing them into one in actuality, since a certain distinction and differentiation without confusion or separation pertains not only to the creation itself, but to the energies and their manifestation. The analogy St Maximus uses is that of a circle, which finds its unity through the relationship of the circumference to a single centre. Indeed, the centre is in a sense transcendent and unmanifested, although it still locates itself by manifesting the circumference in a particular place. This is of course a very limited analogy, but that centre can be likened to the power of God, which holds the universe together, keeping it aligned with the inner principles according to which it was originally created. Indeed, St Maximus goes on to say that, "I am not saying that there are two kinds of providence and judgment, for they are potentially one and the same, but insofar as they relate to us, they assume different and varied activities." And the terms in the Greek here are dunamin and energean, emphasizing that distinctions between power and energy. Even better than the circle analogy, I think, the best and most immediate image of what St Maximus's theology is all about is the fractal. It is clear that from his writing that St Maximus thought in fractal terms about the relationship between whole and parts, and between the one and the many. This kind of analogy is naturally applicable at various levels, and is transposed effortlessly to these various modes of contemplation. For the sake of our present argument, we may say quite faithfully, I think, that the very relationship between power and activity, or dunamis and energeia, is symbolized by fractals. Jonathan Armstrong, in the introduction to his translation of St Maximus's On the Ecclesiastical Mystagogy, reads the Confessor's theology in this very light. It is clear that St Maximus employs these terms dunamis and energeia in such a way with reference to the relationships of part and whole in the very layout of the Church, which is an image of the universe. Armstrong writes, "After Maximus establishes that the Church is in the image of God, the second foundational teaching that he draws from the Blessed Elder is that the Church is a representation and image of the entire universe, which subsists in visible and invisible realities, because the Church contains the same oneness and diversity as God." Maximus argues that the Church displays that both the sanctuary and the nave are identical to one another, and illustrates that each one exists in the other according to exchange. Maximus then goes on to explain that, on the one hand, the nave is identical to the sanctuary according to power, because the Eucharist sanctifies the nave. On the other hand, the sanctuary is identical to the nave according to activity. Maximus continues to explain, because it is the place where the never-ending mystagogy begins. These phrases, according to power and according to activity, are repeated throughout the treatise, as Maximus divides all of reality into potentiality and actuality, the transcendent and the immanent, the creator and creation. It's enough to note here that power in this sense precedes activity and is the transcendent source or cause of the activity. Thus it has nothing to do with passive potency in terms of the potential to be affected or actualized by something else. For St Maximus, power and activity, dunamis and energia, are not in any tension or opposition, but exist in a perfect relationship. Dunamis is, however, higher in a causal sense, because it is simpler. Energia is more differentiated, and in that way it reaches down towards creation without being effective passively by the creation. One way to understand this distinction further is with another analogy. Dunamis may be symbolized by a seed, which contains in an unmanifest state all of the information or identity which will produce a tree, for instance. In this sense, it is like active potency in Thomistic terms. Energia would thus in this analogy correspond to the tree qua actualization of the seed. Indeed, this is why the fractal analogy was, I think, so useful, because they operate according to a kind of seminal principle. Potentia, in the sense of passive potency, is by contrast like clay. It has no inherent form or identity, but is able to receive form from something else. The point with the essence-energies distinction, or more properly speaking the power-energies distinction, is that while for us creatures we understand that change is required for the seed to grow into a tree, in God there is no change nor increase in perfection. Nevertheless, we distinguish between the actuality of the tree and the active potency of the seed. Even though the former is implicit in the latter, nonetheless God wills to realize some of his activities eternally, and others for a specific purpose. The activity of creation, for instance, proceeds contingently because it is dependent on God's will. The power to create, however, is natural to God. The analogy is not perfect, and one objection an Aristotelian might raise is that in God there is no matter or passive potency, and the notion of realization in the tree analogy requires a kind of material substrate in order to work. The understanding of actualization in Thomism, for instance, is inextricably bound up with the notion of hylomorphism, and this is the central difficulty, I would hazard to say. Thus, for the Thomist, there is no second actuality in God. There is first actuality, God qua active potency, and second actuality, the effects of God's power, namely creation and other operations or works. We would agree that the movement, so to speak, from first to second actuality is dependent on God's will, and hence creation itself is not a necessary act. This Thomistic view makes God's natural energies impossible, however, in the sense of eternal manifestation ad intra. This is, I would argue, why Thomism runs into difficulties with its Trinitarian theology, because it fails to distinguish between essential and energetic predication. If God is pure active potency essentially, then we have no means of distinguishing between the mutual love of the Trinity and the hypostases. Indeed, the hypostases come to be defined by their energetic relations, which collapses them into the essence in a certain way. This effectively leads to a kind of modalism, because the persons are only modes of a single energy that is the divine essence. To combat this problem, we need to rethink the assumption that realization of a power requires some passive support for said realization, in the manner of hylomorphism. Rather, since God is without passive potency, we need to understand that only a certain intentionality and relationship is required for a power to be realized in a different mode, that is, without any essential change or increase in perfection. That is why a real distinction between nature and person allows the capacity to love to be realized and eternally manifest by being shared actively between the three divine persons, from the Father, through the Son, in the Spirit. Because power is in a sense proper to nature, we require the distinction between power and activity in order to accommodate the hypostatic relations. For it is not a generic divine essence which acts, but divine persons which do. Power is actualized without alteration, precisely because it is exercised relationally, in the unique modes of the divine persons. This concludes our second video on the essence-energy distinction.